Picture this. June 25, 1876. A soldier on horseback tears away from a column of charging cavalry, riding hard in the opposite direction. Not out of cowardice, but because his commanding officer had just handed him a mission. A message to carry, a pack train to locate. He never knew, in that furious moment, that the simple act of riding away would be the only reason he was still breathing 48 hours later. That soldier was Sergeant Daniel Kanipe, though history has rendered his name in a dozen different forms. A 22-year-old infantryman from Burke County, North Carolina, serving with Company C of the 7th United States Cavalry. He rode away. The rest of his company rode forward, and what happened next became one of the most debated, mythologized, and misunderstood engagements in American military history. Before we continue, please, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our history and stories. One has to wonder, what does it feel like to be the man who survived, not because of anything heroic he did in the heat of battle, but simply because he was in the right place, carrying the right message? Kanipe spent the rest of his long life answering that question, and his first-hand account offers us something most historical records cannot: the ground-level texture of a catastrophe unfolding in real time. To make sense of Kanipe's perspective at the Little Bighorn, we first have to map out the reality of the 7th Cavalry's world in those final frantic weeks. The year 1876 was America's centennial year, a nation busy celebrating 100 years of independence, hosting grand exhibitions in Philadelphia, congratulating itself on its manifest destiny. And yet, out on the northern plains of Montana Territory, a collision between that destiny and the sovereign resistance of the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne peoples was building to a breaking point. The Great Sioux War of 1876 had been triggered, in no small part, by the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, land sacred to the Sioux, guaranteed to them by the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. When the government failed to keep prospectors out and then attempted to buy the hills outright and failed, military pressure was authorized instead. General Alfred Terry commanded the Department of Dakota, and he was coordinating a three-pronged campaign designed to encircle and force the submission of the non-treaty bands led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Kanipe's regiment departed on May 17, 1876, marching toward the Yellowstone River. By June 10th, they had pushed as far as the Powder River. 6 companies were detached on a reconnaissance mission along the Rosebud, carrying 10 days' rations on pack mules, stripped down, fast-moving, and deliberately cutting themselves off from the wagon train. What they found along the Rosebud was an Indian trail of staggering scale, the sheer breadth of the tracks, the trampled earth, the abandoned campsites. All of it pointed toward a gathering of warriors far larger than anyone in the American command seemed willing to fully reckon with. Here is something many casual accounts of Little Bighorn omit entirely, and it matters. When Kanipe's detachment under Major Reno rejoined the regiment at the confluence of the Rosebud and Yellowstone rivers, they discovered that Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer had been placed under arrest. Not on the battlefield, before it. The reason was political and deeply entangled in the corruption scandals of the Grant administration. Custer, never a man to hold his tongue, had publicly criticized the so-called trader post system, a scheme in which post sutlers connected to War Secretary William Belknap and other political cronies held monopoly concessions at frontier army posts. Soldiers had no choice but to purchase overpriced goods, a small glass of whiskey going for 25 cents when the army pay barely stretched, from vendors operating through official corruption. Custer had set price caps. That defiance cost him his command temporarily and nearly kept him off the campaign entirely. He lobbied President Grant personally, appealed to General Sherman, and was ultimately permitted to rejoin the expedition, But the arrest was real, the tension was real, and the fact that Custer rode into the valley of the Little Bighorn with something to prove cannot be dismissed as mere color. By the evening of June 24th, the regiment had arrived at a location where the Sioux had recently performed both a war dance and a sun dance. The ground was packed firm and smooth from the ceremony, ringed with brush shelters made from cottonwood. 6 Crow Indian scouts, men who harbored their own ancient enmity toward the Sioux, found the scalp of a white soldier from Gibbon's command hanging from a willow twig. Their reaction was visceral, almost ritualistic, shouting, dancing, seized by what Kanipe described as something close to exultation. The scalp was returned to Custer, who examined it and passed it along. It was a warning. Not everyone read it that way. That night, a mundane accident changed everything. As the regiment entered a ravine at a hard trot, the quartermaster sergeant lost several crates of hardtack from the pack mules. When he rode back to retrieve them, he found 2 Sioux warriors helping themselves to the bread. They fled when they saw him coming. When Custer learned of this, he understood that the element of surprise, the cornerstone of his tactical plan, was gone. Rather than wait for dawn and allow the village to scatter, he ordered the regiment to move immediately. No bugles, no fires beyond what was needed to brew coffee. Hand signals only. The 7th Cavalry rode through the night like a shadow across the high divide. Custer called a halt at the crest of a long ridge. He rode out with 2 scouts and his head trumpeter, Henry Voss, and was gone for 2 hours. When he returned, the regiment was divided into 4 columns. Major Reno received 3 companies. Captain Benteen received 3 more. Captain McDougall was assigned the pack train with a single company as escort, and Custer himself retained 4 troops, C, E, I, and F, keeping his brother, Tom Custer's Company C, close. This decision, the splitting of the regiment, has been dissected by military historians for nearly 150 years. Critics argue Custer divided his force recklessly against an enemy of unknown size. Defenders argue the terrain demanded it, that he expected Reno's attack to fix the warriors in place while his own column hit the northern flank. What Kanipe's account adds to this debate is texture, the sense of urgency, the dust rising like smoke signals from the distant pack train, the men cheering at a full gallop, horses beyond control. "Hold your horses, boys," Custer called out. "There are plenty down there for all of us." Those were among the last words Kanipe ever heard him speak. Captain Tom Custer called Kanipe out of the column before the charge descended into the valley. His horse, Sergeant Finkel's horse, both animals pushed hard all night, were struggling. Finkel had fallen back slightly. Kanipe was still close. Tom Custer handed him the orders verbally. "Find Captain McDougall in the pack train. Tell him to move directly to the high ground. If the packs come loose, don't stop to fix them. Cut them free and keep moving. A large Indian camp is ahead." Kanipe rode back. As he moved toward the distant dust cloud of the mule train, he turned and watched his company, his friends, his sergeant, his captain, ride hard and fast down into the valley. The cheers of the men floated back toward him through the dry summer air. He would never see most of them alive again. Had Finkel not fallen slightly behind, Finkel would have received those orders. Kanipe acknowledges this plainly. He did not survive through superior skill or tactical brilliance. He survived because of a tired horse and the timing of a captain's decision. History, as it turns out, often works exactly like this. After delivering Custer's orders to McDougall, Kanipe rode to find Captain Benteen, who was supposed to be in support but was still miles away. By the time Kanipe rejoined the main body, Reno's battalion was in full retreat up the bluffs, pursued by warriors who were shooting and closing fast. Men were falling before anyone could reach them. Dr. DeWolf was killed at the very crest of the ridge. A few steps further, and he would have been safe. The consolidated force of Reno, Benteen, and McDougall dug in on a long hilltop. And then the siege began. For 36 hours, through the afternoon of the 25th, all through the night, and deep into the 26th, warriors kept them pinned. There were 68 wounded men in the perimeter. The heat was relentless, and the nearest water was at the river far below, guarded by riflemen. Men who attempted to reach it were shot. The sound of the wounded crying for water, Kanipe later recalled, stayed with him for the rest of his life. On the night of June 25th, distant sounds carried across the valley, the sounds of what appeared to be celebration in the Sioux camp. The terrible implication was not lost on the survivors. Now, here is where the popular mythology of Custer's last stand needs to be examined honestly, because it has obscured more than it has illuminated. The romantic image of Custer, standing alone, pistols blazing, surrounded by fallen heroes in a heroic circle, was constructed largely after the fact, driven by dime novels, paintings, and the propaganda needs of a nation processing a humiliating defeat. The most famous painting of the battle, by Cassily Adams and later Anheuser-Busch, was distributed to saloons across America and became the defining image for a generation. It shows Custer upright, sword raised, defiant to the last. The reality Kanipe describes is different. When he visited the battlefield on June 27th, the bodies were scattered, stripped of every piece of clothing, many mutilated. The dead had been lying in the summer sun for 2 days. Kanipe found Sergeant Finley, the man who had carried the crow scalp in his saddle pocket, lying at the head of his horse Carlo, with 12 arrows in his body. He found Sergeant Finkel, who had fallen behind on his exhausted horse, dead among the others. Custer himself lay not on a dramatic hilltop in a heroic pose, but across a small cluster of fallen men, touching the ground only at the small of his back, shot through the heart. Around him were the bodies of his brother Tom and his brother-in-law Lieutenant Calhoun. There was no dramatic last stand. There was a collapse, fast, overwhelming, and total. Not a single man from Custer's 4 companies survived to report what had happened. The battle reconstruction historians have worked with ever since is built from archaeological evidence, Native American testimony, and the accounts of men like Kanipe, who arrived only in the aftermath. One detail in Kanipe's account deserves particular attention because it speaks to a command decision that still generates debate. Before departing up the Rosebud, Custer was offered 2 Gatling guns and 2 Rodman artillery pieces. He declined them all, surrendered them to General Gibbon, on the grounds that they would slow his column's pace. Kanipe is unsparing in his retrospective judgment. A single Rodman cannon, he argues, fired once into the village, would have ended the battle before it began. The warriors would not have stood against artillery. There would have been no massacre. This is, of course, a survivor's hindsight. But it is not an unreasonable military assessment. The Sioux and Cheyenne fighters were extraordinarily disciplined and courageous against cavalry, but no indigenous force on the northern plains had a tactical response prepared for field artillery. The decision to leave the guns behind tells us something essential about Custer, his confidence, his preference for speed and shock over firepower and caution, and perhaps his awareness that a decisive, dramatic victory would be far more valuable to him politically than a methodical siege. On the morning of June 27th, the firing stopped. The Sioux and Cheyenne camp, an encampment Kanipe estimated at 12,000 to 15,000 people with perhaps 4,000 warriors, simply broke up and moved on. General Terry arrived at 10 o'clock with Gibbon's forces. When he rode up to the survivors on the hill, he wept openly. Then the grim work began, burying the dead, gathering the wounded, loading 68 injured men onto mule litters, and transporting them miles to the steamship Far West, waiting on the Yellowstone. Most of the wounded, remarkably, survived. One last survivor deserves mention. Captain Miles Keogh's horse, a tough iron-gray gelding named Comanche, was found on the battlefield with 7 bullet wounds, still alive. he recovered. And by order of General Headquarters, Comanche was retired from service permanently. He would live out his remaining years in a box stall, never ridden again. At dress parades he was led at the front of the regiment, draped in black mourning cloth. He became the regiment's living memorial, the only creature present at the Battle of Custer's column who could not speak, and yet somehow said everything. Daniel Kanipe lived until 1926, 50 years after the battle. He gave interviews, attended reunions, and told his story in careful, measured terms to anyone who would listen. He never claimed more than he knew. He never sensationalized what he had seen. And perhaps that restraint is why his account remains so valuable. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not simply a military defeat. It was a collision of civilizations, a consequence of broken treaties and willful arrogance, a moment when the assumptions of American expansionism ran directly into the organized resistance of people defending their homes, their culture, and their survival. Custer's death became a rallying cry, "Remember Custer." And within years, the Sioux resistance had been broken, the Black Hills seized, the buffalo nearly annihilated, and the reservation system locked into place. One has to sit with that weight. A man riding away from a column, carrying orders, watching his friends disappear into a dust cloud, and then spending 50 years carrying the memory of what came next. History is often made by the famous, but it is remembered by the ones who came back.